and in the commission forums. We appreciate that this work group is diving deeper into that science discussion and the conversation about doing good things for what beaver need, and not just focusing on beavers creating their own habitat. Shannon agrees that during legislative session and now the question still remains, would a ban on beaver trapping have the desired outcome that we all kind of outlined in that value statement? More wetlands, stream complexity, cooler water, additional headwater storage. Again, we appreciate the work group is broadening the discussion toward the habitat needs side, and research needs to monitor those desired outcomes. To finish, Shannon and I want to be, again, real clear that staff are engaged in this work group process for all the components that you saw embedded in the charter, in that value statement, I guess, in the mission and scope. And a lot of those components, they overview habitat resiliency, they overview climate change, and they overview healthy populations of beaver. So in closing, I just say the ODFW staff, all of us involved, along with, I'm sure, each of the participants in the room today and others that aren't, we're looking forward to this process, providing those recommendations on steps moving forward to the commission. And then the commission can provide that subsequent direction after their full consideration. So just wanted to put that out there, Jamie, make sure we can have a good full conversation today on what's on the agenda.
Appreciate that, Kevin. Thank you. We want to go ahead and put the slides back up. Sam? So these are the key questions. Let's come back to that. Let's go ahead and go to the agenda. There we go. So what we wanted to do today, first I want to say thank you everybody for your willingness, your patience, your cooperation in getting all the affinity group meetings scheduled, and in your participation in those in advance of this meeting. We weren't sure what would happen. We ended up meeting with everybody. So really appreciate the time that folks put in. And so what we want to do today is start out our meeting with hearing from each of the affinity groups. Everybody has a reporter, so to speak, from their group, just to share kind of where they're at and some, what they like about where we're headed, maybe any concerns that they are still on the table, and anything that might be missing that they're hoping the group will talk about. So those are the three things. And then we'll take a step back and look at those in relation to where we are with the recommendations discussion. I'll probably at that point turn it over to the subgroup to see what questions they have, because they're the ones that are taking the deeper dive together with Sam and I on actually putting words to the page about what this report's going to look like. And so before we launch into that, I do want to say
Who's this?
that, hi, Wayne. Go ahead. There you go. I do want to say that we had the conversation about scheduling with everybody in the affinity groups, and that folks are 100% on board with the schedule that has been proposed by the subgroup and by Sam and I. So appreciate that. So we are on track to really try to meet an April commission meeting. For those of you who in the public who are watching this meeting, what we talked about with the schedule, and we'll revisit this when we get to the end of the meeting as well. But what we talked about is having Beaver work group meetings about once a month. So we're having the meeting today, we'll have a meeting at the end of February, we'll have a meeting at the end of March, and that the subgroup of Chris and Amy and Jefferson and Leland, together with Sam and I, will continue to work on developing the report of recommendations. And those subgroup meetings will happen about, probably about 2 meetings to every one of the work group meetings. So not quite every other week. And then we're really going to try to meet an April commission meeting if we can, which would be the April 22nd, with the June meeting in our back pocket in case the work group feels like we need just a teeny bit more time. So that's where we are with our schedule. We checked that out with everybody in the affinity group meetings, and folks were on board with that. And so just one other little background piece for folks watching. So we did do, you'll hear the report outs from each of the affinity groups. So we had 1 hour meetings with our science folks, our environment conservation folks, hunters, trappers, land managers, federal partners, our commission liaisons, and our staff. Did I miss anybody, Sam? Nope. So we did little 1 hour meetings with all of them here in the last 2 weeks. And so you'll hear the report outs from each of them today. So I think that brings everybody up to speed in our public about where we landed and where we're going. And so any questions before we launch into the affinity group report outs? Not seeing any. Okay, then we can go ahead and take this down. And then I'm hoping that the report outs are, in the 5 minute range, and we'll pause after each one to see if there's any questions that people have. So about 10 minutes or so, total for each affinity group. So the big question then is, who wants to start? I see Jill is unmuted, but I don't know if Jill wants to start. Oh, Scott, you went ahead and just raised your hand. Did Jill quickly? It's like, no, mute. All right, Scott.
Okay, so I should plan on about 5 minutes here.
Yeah, that would be good. And then if you could also remind everybody who you met, who your group was.
Yeah, as a former trial lawyer, I have to set my little clock on my phone here. Otherwise, I'll just keep talking. So our group includes Brian Poswitz, Jefferson, and Jefferson Jacobs, Sam Bruger, although Sam is no longer part of our group, Daniel Moser she works for Oregon Wild, and I know there are others in our group that whose names I'm skipping right now, but I think that first of all, I want to start by expressing gratitude to Jamie and Sam for the great work that you're doing. And I also want to extend gratitude to ODFW for even making this happen. I am a loud and persistent critic of ODFW. And I know that, that they take arrows from all sides. And so I can't even begin to imagine the challenges that ODFW faces in trying to balance all of the competing interests. So thank you to ODFW and to all of the ODFW staff who have participated in this. You do have our heartfelt gratitude. Having said all that, I would say that there is unanimity in our group, in our affinity group, on the idea that humane values need to inform the outcomes here. And, there's been sort of this feeling that we risk blowing up this process if we even use the word humane, or if we talk about animal welfare, because it may be viewed by some as unacceptably divisive. Because it pits, people who do engage in trapping or who support trapping of beaver against those who oppose it. And I think of Stan Steele and I. Stan and I often joke that he and I could give each other's speeches verbatim because we've heard each other so many times. And, on a lot of issues, Stan and I are on opposite sides. But on the other hand, I think that we've been able over the years to have respectful conversations about wildlife management. And the one thing that Stan and I agree on is that we need more wildlife. We both agree on the need for more abundant wildlife. And I think that includes beavers. But we come to that conclusion from very different perspectives. And those of us in our group believe that it is good and right for us to want beavers to be treated humanely. And that when we are talking about a beaver management strategy or program, that the animal welfare concerns have to play a part and play an important role in that. We believe that beavers have an inherent value and that there is value in protecting beavers that has nothing to do whatsoever with human interests, that beavers deserve to be protected and valued for their own sake, just like every other wildlife species. We're very much aware of the scientific and ecological benefits of beavers. We understand that beavers are such an important species in the ecosystem services that they provide. And all of that is absolutely important to us in our group. But there is also a desire for us to want these animals to be treated humanely. And, you know, we believe that the recreational drowning of animals is unacceptably inhumane. That doesn't mean that we suddenly expect that trapping of beavers is going to be stopped or rolled back, but there is very much the sense that those of us who embrace humane values, for whom this is a very important part of the conversation, are being dismissed. And you know, back in 2012, when we filed a petition on trap check times, you know, what was revealed was that internally ODFW only viewed the trappers themselves as legitimate stakeholders, that they did not view humane groups or groups that are fighting for wildlife for its own sake do not have a legitimate voice. And the reason why that's so problematic is because we believe that these values, there went my 5 minutes, these values are the values of most Oregonians. And you know, we saw, you know, I've been involved in wildlife since 1993 when I started working on the campaign to pass Measure 18. And I've been fighting for wildlife in Oregon ever since then. And so I have, I think, a really good sense of how the internal culture of ODFW views all of the non-consumptive users who want more protections for wildlife, not less. So all of that is to say, thank you for letting us participate in this process. Thank you, ODFW, for being willing to accommodate all of these points of view. We do believe that humane values should inform the final result. We do believe that animal welfare is an important factor in these conversations, in addition to all of the essential ecological, scientific, and other public policy considerations. So that's it. That's it from us.
Thanks, Scott. Appreciate those, you being willing to step forward and your 5-minute timer. So, Stan, did you have a clarifying question for Scott? Or do you want to go next? Actually, you're muted, Stan. You're looking for the unmute. I can see that. Let me come back to you. And actually, oh, there she is, tech support. So who would like to go next? Amy, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, I'll jump in because ours is pretty easy. Our affinity group with the hunters and the trappers was myself and Tyler and Stan. And Stan and I had an opportunity to have a phone call this morning prior to the meeting. So the outcomes that we'd like to see or focus on as we go forward with the crafting the recommendations are really leaning heavily into the data collection focus for ODFW. We would really like to focus in on how we help the agency get more robust data sets that you know, helps both the agency and our follow-on conversations around this topic. As I'm sure this is not going to be, you know, when this work group eventually does wrap up, this won't be the end of the conversations around the topic. So it would be really great to have more data to lean into that will help inform the conversations. And also a really robust beaver population, beaver presence research endeavor would be something that we would be very interested in supporting going forward as well. It kind of couples pretty well with the first topic there of more data collection within ODFW. But this could be something that is cross boundaries, obviously on state, federal lands, and in both state and federal partner purview to put together. So those are really where we see a lot of warrant for our focus going forward. So pretty short and simple there. So figured we'd jump in and get that one out of the way.
Thanks, Amy.
I guess I can go next.
Okay, Lauren, go ahead.
So the land managers, myself, and Brenda and Kyle, we will be pretty brief as well. When we looked at the list here, we agree with Amy where the focus should be on a lot of population data collection and landscape analysis. We also, while we have no interest in discussing the policies set forth on beaver management from the private forest accord, we do think that we should have some discussion on the potential of an influx of beaver population due to the relocation that's required under that. And so we anticipate we'll be seeing beavers being relocated onto federal lands, and what does that look like as far as beaver management on those federal lands as part of that. And then also we had some questions about whether or not we need to look at some of the effects of additional beavers on lands and the downstream effects when eventually there's events where beaver habitats are being washed downstream, and what does that look like, and how do we manage those as well as we see increased beaver population as far as land management is concerned. So additionally, we will also chime in that we think that beaver classification is a discussion better suited for ODA as opposed to ODFW. So we're not really interested in having that discussion either. So, but I'm happy to discuss how we manage influx of beavers and population data and landscape analysis and all of that as we look at increased beaver populations.
Great, thank you, Lauren. Who wants to go next? Chris?
Yeah, so I'll speak up for the research affinity group that met. And that group was Leland, Jimmy, Boone, Bob, Ernie, and myself. Wayne was also on the invite list but wasn't able to attend. And I also noticed that Leland, Bob, and Boone were part of that meeting and are not here today. So I'm going to say that we elected one of them to be our spokesman, because I don't think we talked about this assignment at that meeting, unless I've forgotten. And so they said they do it, and then they didn't show up here. So I'm going to step in. It looks like the only left standing are from that meeting are Ernie and Jimmy and I. So please weigh in if I'm mischaracterizing something that I did not plan on summarizing. So we had a very robust, fun discussion around the science and research of the topics that we have been struggling with in this work group over the last months. It probably was the best and most sort of wide-ranging conversation that we've been able to have within this work group. And so I think at the end we all felt that we should have been doing this more often to move some of these conversations forward. Really the topic of our conversation was how to manage beaver and beaver modified floodplains to minimize risk over all of Oregon, over all the risk factors, to maximize all of the benefits that we've talked about over all of Oregon. And what can ODFW, what role does ODFW play in that question? There wasn't so much a disagreement or any disagreement around what does the science tell us on how to act, as much as saying we'll never get a definitive answer. So we won't be able to just say, oh, science says do X, and then it's really easy for an agency to implement X. What we're going to deal with is in this risk context of sort of how to reduce risk. What are prudent actions to reduce risk? And this is a more probabilistic response than a deterministic response, which is difficult to do. It's difficult to advise in. It's difficult to interpret the information, and that's the context. It's more in the realm of economists than it is in sort of natural resource scientists in terms of thinking about how do we move forward in a way that's beneficial, knowing that we are in a sense taking some chances, and what's our framework for decision makings that values all the information that we have, both plus and minus on weighing towards that decision, but still being able to move, not being paralyzed by that lack of perfect information, and move forward in a framework that's informed by that is more likely to achieve positive benefits than doing nothing. And so that's what allows us to move forward, and we can give it names like precautionary principle or risk management. It's really all the same thing, is how to move forward in the lack of perfect information or what looks like perfect agreement across all sectors on a strategy. And so this is the science group saying, yes, we all agree on the principles of increased value to Oregonians and to the landscape from connected floodplains, and agree that beaver play a role in that through their natural behavior, and agree that there are human-beaver conflicts, and agree that there's some uncertainty around exactly how all this plays out across the landscape, especially in the disturbed landscape that we currently exist in. We do not have perfect forests and riverscapes anywhere. And so how do we, when we think about the biology, the ecology, the physics that we're dealing with, we think about it in the context of that disturbed landscape, as well as in what the landscape could be, and how the natural response of those riverscapes to the natural change agents in a very unnatural situation. So that generates lots of apparently conflicting observations in the science world around the same phenomena, and that's really trying to contextualize that. You see, so we've seen pros and cons of the impacts of beavers on the landscape, and how do we interpret that in that light of living in a disturbed landscape? That's that imperfect information we use. How do we take those general principles and guide our recommendations and guide moving forward? So I will solicit extra input from other members of that group, since we hadn't agreed on a message and agreed on a messenger. At least I don't remember. I have notes to that effect. But thank you.
Thanks, Chris. So Jimmy, Ernie, Chris is looking for any input from the two of you to pad it out. Go ahead, Jimmy.
Yeah, thanks, Chris, for winging that. You did a good job. I don't remember us talking about someone being the note taker and speaker either, so thank you. I'd just like to also mention that in terms of the risk that Chris talked about, one of the things that we discussed was that not all of the benefits or not all of the values that Beaver provide are positive. There are some negatives, and in making recommendations for any decisions, we don't want to forget that at least this is from my perspective, that those recommendations need to include the risk that Chris mentioned, and that there are positive and negative benefits that could come from those recommendations or changes that we make. And another thing is, it seems to be that some of the discussion suggests, not just within the affinity group, but over the several meetings that we've had, there's maybe some hidden implication that there's a lack of management on federal lands in Oregon, or a lack of concern for beaver and the benefits they provide. And one of the things that I brought up in our affinity group discussion is that there are a lot of things going on federal lands where the benefits of beaver are being maximized, and there are beaver management activities that are occurring on federal lands, and there are some positive benefits, and we've seen that in some of the presentations that have been given. So I'd just like for us to consider that, and in the context of making more recommendations to ODFW staff, that there is a lot of good work going on out there. And furthermore, we did talk about the need for research. I'm a big proponent for that, and I've heard some of the other people speaking this morning saying a need for research. But we also said that research is not required for everything, but in cases where management occurs, we at least need to monitor the effects of that and not just do an action and call it good because we think it's going to be good. So even if research is not applied to these management actions, we recommend that some type of monitoring at least occurs so that over time we can quantify these benefits and maybe better mitigate these risks that Chris mentioned. If I misspoke there, Chris, please weigh back in, but thanks.
Thanks, Jimmy, for weighing in. Are we ready to hear from the next group? Stan, did you have a question? Where is that tech support when you need her? Darn it. Oh, I'll watch for Stan's being able to unmute. So the three groups we have left are federal partners, ODFW staff, and the commission. I kind of like to have the commissioners go last. So federal partners, do you want to go next?
Sure. And I can start similarly to Chris's statement. We didn't discuss providing a summary there. So just give a real high level summary of our discussion yesterday. And then Darren, yeah, please weigh in and clean up what I don't get correct. So, just want to start out by recognizing the kind of regulatory framework upon which we work, and that state has the authority to manage wildlife populations and set seasons. And we as federal land managers, we work on managing the habitat. And so that's a framework upon which we want to share this information, and also want to highlight there are really good opportunities for additional collaborative shared stewardship prioritization of monitoring efforts for beaver and aquatic area function in collaboration with ODFW in priority areas. And so we have been doing some of that work, and I think this work group and the management recommendations that will follow, I think will stimulate some additional opportunities for that collaboration between the states and the federal agencies in terms of monitoring, mapping, reporting, and sharing information. We did talk about, a couple areas where time-limited, short duration closures would be beneficial in places where we are translocating beaver, to allow those beaver to recover in those translocated areas there to really establish themselves. So again, with a time-limited closure from a trapping perspective. Then also from an area where we are actively working on in-stream restoration for ESA listed salmonid habitat there, primarily Orkin coho in the Coast Range, where we're doing a lot of aquatic in-stream restoration work to mimic some of the habitat features created by beavers, where beaver presence is being desired, and we're trying to lure them off of private lands back onto public lands there. We'd like to, it would be beneficial to consider trapping closures so we could both take advantage of the active restoration of our in-stream work as well as the passive restoration benefits from the presence of beaver. And then we also did discuss, there are federal lands are not all managed uniformly. We do break our lands into different land use allocations, and some of them may be more suitable for trapping than others. But again, that is a state management authority there. And then the last one that we did touch on briefly is that classification of beaver as a predatory animal by ODA definitely does limit our ability to work with the state to translocate beaver onto federal lands, and that increases the need for downstream coordination on those translocation efforts. And so looking at a different way to potentially work with Oregon Department of Agriculture in a fashion similar to elk, where potentially depredation permits could be issued, but the trapping and removal of beaver off of those private lands adjacent to federal lands could be monitored and measured. So we could actually quantify that over the long term to see if there is any potential effect limiting recolonization or movement off of beaver, off of private lands onto federal lands. And so that just, some of the discussion points we made yesterday, and Darren definitely opened up to you to clarify what I screwed up there.
You didn't screw anything up. You did perfect.
Nothing to add, Darren?
No, he covered pretty much everything. So,
Okay. Thank you, Josh. So we did meet with ODFW. Oh, there's Stan. All right. We're going to take a pause because Stan has been valiantly trying to ask a question.
So can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you fine.
Okay, we had to change the devices. The laptop wasn't functioning as we'd hoped. So seems how I've been getting parts and parcel of this, I have several different comments, but going back to Scott and one of the statements was those of us who have humane values, there's an assumption there that the rest of us do not. Yeah, I find that a little alarming. I really think that all conservationists, whether you're a harvester or a non-harvester, probably do have humane values. We all share that. And then moving on to the monitoring part of this, and Josh just talked about having, a pretty broad scope geographic closures put in any place where they have salmon habitat projects going on either federally managed lands. And I've been sitting here in a basin that has extensively had those projects going on for decades now through the Alsea Watershed Council, Mid-Coast Watershed Council, and others. So you could, if you went on that premise, you could close this whole 360 square mile basin, and we would find that objectionable. And here's probably one of the main reasons we would, is we've had 50-year closures in Eastern Oregon on numerous different streams. And where's the monitoring? Where's the federal land monitoring of whether those have been beneficial to getting us to those desired benefits? And then when we're talking about now with this program that the federal agencies are looking at of also having monitoring going on adjacent in holdings or other private lands, to where they're going to say that those could have significant impact on beaver restoration or recolonization on those adjacent federal lands, raises a whole other issue of concern. And I know that it was talked about earlier, but I would be remiss from the trapper's point of perspective if I did not bring this up on the private forest accords. How throughout this process, we've been told that, look, there is if federal lands are closed to the regulated harvest, it will still be open on many of these other adjacent lands, whether it's ag lands or private forest lands. And we're seeing that through the PFA, that's not necessarily the case. So there seems to be some, in my opinion, and in the trapper's opinion, some little disingenuous negotiation that's going on here. And it's really hard for us to come in and act in good faith when we see that faith is not being equalized across the board. So those are just a few of the things, but the monitoring is a huge question. We just finished up an extensive process called the Rogue South Coast Fisheries Management Plan. And one of the key things that we always know ODFW has problems with is having adequate funding for monitoring, whether it's a fisheries issues, black-tailed deer issue, elk issue, wolf issue, whatever it is. Monitoring is very expensive. So I'm just going to throw it right out there right now that I would think that one of the things that all affinities can come to agreement on is to have a substantial ask to have financial support coming from legislative support built into ODF. Any action that we come out of these work groups that has a substantial ask for financial support for adequate monitoring programs. And I'll just leave it at that. We can close everything, but if we don't monitor it, it's just coming under the assumption that closure is good. Without monitoring, that question will be just like all of the Eastern Oregon closures we have now. And I've repeatedly heard our federal partners say, we have no idea whether they've been beneficial or not. Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. So we've got, so Kevin, did you want to go ahead and share on behalf of the ODFW staff? Is that why you raised your hand?
Yeah, thanks, Jamie.
Great.
And
Okay.
mine will be really short. You know, we you know, as we explained before, as we got into the you know, first just doing some of the other exercises with the Jamboard, and from there, we really are wanting to be and staying on the lane with that listen and learn more mode. We've been trying to inform the, you know, discussions that have gone on at the point. Last time we thought it was really important for Tom and Matt to present some of the analysis that they had. And hopefully those stimulated some discussions in those subgroups. But, you know, our role is going to continue to be, we want to, you know, help the work group discussions move along, stay informed where appropriate from the state side. But we really want to make sure that we stay in our lane to participate, but not to try to shape those things. And so we don't have a, you know, a complete outline for each of those other tasks that you put on the subgroups. Thanks, Jamie.
All right, thank you, Kevin. So our last group then is our commissioner group. We met with Jill and Mary and Becky, who would like to share where you're at.
Commissioner Zarnowitz, would you like to share?
It was a long time ago.
I know.
Right.
We talked about report out either, did we?
Yeah, no, we didn't.
Okay, we're failing here. Your commissioners are failing right in front of you. But I know Jill can be solid here for us.
Well, I would say we're along the lines of what ODFW says. We're here to listen and learn, and then move concepts forward. And I think that we've certainly heard a lot of good information that is going to provide basically, I think, some changes along the way. But we, at this point in time, I don't think we're very clear on exactly what those changes will come out to be. One thing is definitely, as others have said, getting together on the funding for monitoring would be very important. And I think more monitoring and more getting more information on beaver populations would be good. So I think I'll leave it at that, Becky.
Okay, and I might just add one thing onto this. Just a gratefulness for this group as a whole. I was really pleased to hear Chris Jordan mention the value of their subgroup meeting together. You know, this is what we make it. This is what you guys make it, and what you choose to bring in front of the commission for us to consider. And I know these are rocky issues that are divided, but I appreciate people making this attempt. This is, you know, this is a gift to Oregon and a gift to its beavers for people to come together and define some recommendations. And I especially agree, just have to appreciate I think it was, oh dear, who was it this morning? I'm looking at the names. I just want to say I appreciate that little bit extra effort for people to cross divides, not because we have to agree, but because we have to make new ground in Oregon. We have to, that they're, you know, and as commissioners, we're not magicians. We can't take a fighting bunch of people and come up with magic. So thanks for your efforts is all I will say. And I'll say I'm getting COVID. Thank you to my son. So if I seem like emotional and weird and kind of headachy and out there, I'm very vaccinated. It's my second round of COVID, but if I just seem a little odd right now, that's why. So thank you all for being here and continuing to try. It's a small glimmer of hope for Oregon when we try, right?
Thanks, Becky. We'll do our best to not take advantage of you in your fragile state. Mary, is there anything you wanted to add?
The only thing I would add, Jamie, is that I continue to look at this, and I think I'm hearing it, that we are trying, a lot of people have talked about managing species in a landscape context, and this is one of the efforts to move us along that continuum so that we are managing these species on the landscape for the benefits that they provide, especially in this one we've talked about in the context of climate change, water flow and retention and temperature. And I think I'm hearing it. That's always how I'm looking at this, is in that context. Are we moving the state along the continuum of how we're managing these species so we're getting more benefits? So that's the only thing I would add. And thank you to everybody.
Thank you, Mary. And so, thanks all of you affinity groups for doing that report out. Kind of following on Stan's lead, what we wanted to do next is really just see what questions you had for each other based on what you heard from the different groups. And before we kind of take a little bit deeper dive into the topics on the Jamboard and tease those out a little bit more. And so, Stan raised some observations and reflections based on what he heard. Are there other questions that people have for each other based on what you've heard, or observations or reflections that you want to share? Chris, go ahead, and then Brian's on deck.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I have been struggling in this process of how to reconcile some of the tools and ideas that have come forward from the Jamboard with our overall sort of goal statement. And then hearing Chair Wall just now reflecting on climate change, landscape scale, and then the potential benefits. If we're thinking of sort of our primary tool, and also listening to Stan's question legitimately about, okay, what's the scale and the impact of potential, using trapping closures as one of the tools, not the only one. Those are potentially small scale actions relative to the entire state of Oregon. And if we're trying to achieve landscape scale or benefits for all of Oregon, how do we reconcile those things? How do we act at a state level and achieve state level benefits? Is that just a lofty goal that we can't really get to? If that's really our goal of floodplain reconnection broadly across the state, this is one piece, and we're talking about one suite of actions. How do we fit that in, and how do we make that? How do we ensure that what we're adding to the landscape of new processes and questions that are facing ODF&W as well as potentially other state agencies, how do we fit that in? We're trying to achieve these goals very broadly. How much can we achieve, and how do we use our tools to get there? And not that I want to limit what we're doing. I would love us to be able to accomplish all of that. I'm struggling at what's our authority, what's our ability, and how do we get there? How do we think at that landscape scale, and act at that landscape scale, and not accept less than that? If that's as the commissioners are asking us. So that's one of my many struggles in this, is thinking about really wanting a grand outcome, the potential to see a big outcome, and we've all talked about it. And then what's on our sort of list of things to do are potentially smaller actions, but how do we magnify them? How do we roll them up? How do we think big? Okay, I'll stop. I'm rambling.
Not rambling at all, Chris. I think that you raised some good, good questions, and we've talked about that in terms of scale. And the notes that I had here that I wrote down are, how do we connect up the actions that this group can recommend to ODFW to do with sort of the suite of actions that we're trying to put in place to affect the big changes that we want to affect. So I think that those are appropriate questions, for the group to consider. Brian, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. So yeah, Scott did a good job of summarizing our conversation in the, I guess, the conservation affinity group, and in particular, the idea that, we'd like just some reflection in the documents that some people care about how we're managing beavers for the sake of the beavers themselves, not just for the modified floodplain landscapes they create. And then, I did have a couple of questions, which is a couple of other things we discussed in our affinity group. One had to do with how beavers are classified in the ODFW and the state classification scheme. And I recognize on private land, they're classified as predatory. That's statutory. ODFW can't change that, as I understand the law. But we're wondering if there's any flexibility for classification on public land. I think right now they're classified as fur bearers. Is there another category that might give them more attention from a conservation perspective? We're interested in whether there's any flexibility on that. And then also whether, there's a thing I believe called the conservation plan that has strategy species. I don't know how beavers are treated in that, but we thought that might be good to have them be a strategy species in the conservation plan, interested in the department's response to that, and others, of course. And then we also talked about whether it could be helpful to move the management authority from beavers, from the fur bearer program, say, to the habitat division or something like that. Interested in responses to that. I know that's a lot there, but I'll get it all out at once.
That is a lot there. So the three things that I heard, and Jefferson, I see your hand up, but it does make sense, I think, to pause and hear people's responses and reactions to the three things that Brian put out. So Brian, what I heard was, you understand that the predator classification is set in a different forum, and it is what it is, but you're wondering if there's flexibility around the categorization of beaver on federal land. So that's one, and what that flexibility would be and how that helps us, and what the options are. The second one I heard is that there's the conservation strategy, and their strategy species, and is there an opportunity to have beaver be a strategy species, and how does that help us, and what does that mean? And I'm sorry, Brian, but there was a third, and I have lost.
Yeah, and the third is just how about moving management authority from the fur bearer program to another? And just to be clear, this isn't just me talking today, just making this stuff up for the first time. It was part of the conversation we had in our affinity group.
Yeah, I understand that. So it's moving beaver out of the fur bearer program, or just options around that within, maybe to the habitat, or just a different way to treat it. All right, so those are the three things that Brian, the questions that he has of everyone based on what we've heard. So I think the first, and we talked about this a little bit in with our federal land managers, if Kevin, good, I'm glad to see your hand up. It's just like, not sure who to ping on this one, but I know we did talk with our federal partners yesterday about sort of categories in their world that could be helpful in terms of partnerships and managing beaver. Oh, Lauren, I'm sorry. So go ahead, Kevin.
Okay, and don't know if this will answer exactly what you were looking for an answer for, but I wanted to just provide a little bit of information on the conservation strategy species, or the Oregon conservation strategy in general. So it was mentioned to, give the species itself that designation of a conservation strategy species. And so what I did was spend a little bit of time with the strategy looking at it's not just strategy species that are a really important component of our conservation strategy. It's also a strategy habitats. And, those two types of overlap between strategy habitats and strategy species really do provide individually embedded in each of the discussions of those recommendations on how to do things better on the landscape, really try to provide a blueprint for some recommendations for conservation efforts to address those habitats and species. So in the conservation strategy, there is a strategy habitat. It's a riparian, flowing water and riparian area strategy habitat. And in there, it talks about beaver. It talks about making sure that you develop habitat and direct habitat toward enhancing beaver and the activities that they can provide. So I just want to make sure and emphasize that that discussion about beavers and the role they can play on the landscape in that habitat is certainly already there in our Oregon conservation strategy. So just really wanted to just point that out, Jamie.
And Kevin, if we can stick with you just for a moment. So one of the things I think Brian was looking at is kind of what are the options and how do those options help us? And so is there like an ability to do more emphasis, on the strategy habitat, emphasizing beaver, and how does that help us achieve our objectives? I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth, Brian, but I think that he's looking for kind of what the range of options are.
Yeah, and so the Oregon Conservation Strategy is what every state has a state wildlife action plan that's required if you want to bring in federal dollars into your conservation management programs in that state agency. That our Oregon Conservation Strategy is that state wildlife action plan. And through the federal process, it has a process piece that they have when it's adopted by or approved by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for us to publish and move forward with. It has then revision dates that are kind of set in play for all the states. So we aren't at the major revision date, but we did make some minor revisions. Those minor revisions including, changing names of species and adding some of the sensitive species or categorization of, like the marble murrelet, we had to update that on our strategy, conservation strategy. So there is a timing of that and a framework that allows for those changes. And that does include adding additional strategy species. And so what we look back to then is the matrix, how we develop our strategy species. And we use that matrix to try to make sure that we're consistently addressing, that kind of the moniker of a strategy species. And I can't tell you exactly how beaver would fit in that. When we look across Orbic or some other species databases, you can see that beaver is an abundant species across the landscape. So in some ways it falls out of that strategy species need. Doesn't mean it's not an important species, doesn't mean that we wouldn't do great things management wise. And it doesn't mean we couldn't evaluate that in our next major revision. But I think we're lined up to do that. I'm going through my brain here. It might be in 23 is when we start, 23 or 24 is when we start up that major revision process.
So just to run with this a little bit more, so a possible recommendation from this group could be for ODFW to consider beaver as a strategy species in the update of the Oregon Conservation Plan.
Yes, Jamie, absolutely. And I think we've talked about that. That is a simple recommendation that is meaningful. It's time oriented and I think is appropriate from some of the discussions in the group. If I remember from the JAM board exercise, when people reported out, I would say that item appeared pretty much across every group that met there. So that seems to be an easy recommendation that kind of floats up top that people had already discussed, pretty early on. Yeah. And then Derek also sent me a note as I was talking about the riparian flowing water stuff, Tom Stahl did, that he also had looked in the wetland strategy habitat, and there's some additional discussion about beaver and beaver, the structures and interaction with that strategy habitat type. So certainly the benefits of beaver is already in the conservation strategy. sounds like just a recommendation of group is to enhance that.
And then the last part of Brian's question, and then Jefferson, we'll move on to your questions, is around the fur bearer, having beavers in or out of the fur bearer program or move to the habitat program or having a part in peace. I don't know if there's any thoughts that you have on that, he had a question about that. Brian, did I ask that appropriately?
Yeah, there's kind of two distinct questions. One, management authority, what department or division, I think is the right word, is it in? Is there anything that can be done there that could be helpful? I guess the question is whether it's possible, even if you may not agree with it. And then two, just designation. I know we can't change it on private land, but on public land, can it be changed to something other than fur bearer that would give them more protection?
Yeah, I don't know the exact answer for some of the intent of what you're asking. I mean, as a fur bearer, it has protection across the board. It has protections for take, there's seasons there. I mean, I don't know what other level of protection you're looking for. We look at like wolves, they're a special status game mammal. So just having it as a game species as a fur bearer for recreational pursuit doesn't lessen protection. It in fact is already an enhanced protection. On the question of taking a fur bearer program, putting it over into another one, probably a little bit beyond my pay grade to look at some of the, what you outline under those, but there is not a silo between Habitat Division and Wildlife Division. When you look at components of the Habitat Division, Western Oregon Stream Restoration Program, you look at habitat restoration, the BPA, the Bonneville Power Administration, fish habitat projects, those are in Habitat Division. And that's where some of the work on, BD, artificial beaver dams, all that sort of stuff, that's where some of that implementation on the ground work is occurring. So there's not a silo just because the fur bearer program and management of the fur bearer regulations occurs in ours. We also have, across Fish Division, lots of dialogue about how that plays into coho recovery, other listed fish. So there's not a silo amongst any of the divisions. So we would have to see whether that's really a meaningful change or not, because the implementation side of doing good things on the ground for beaver is already occurring in Habitat Division.
Yeah, thanks for all those answers.
Thank you, Kevin. All right, Jefferson, you're on. What questions or observations do you have from what you heard from everybody?
I'll try to keep it quick. One, I did want to follow up on Brian's comments about strategy species, and he was rather gentle about that, but it was a big topic of the conversation. So I think it is worth adding. And just from my own personal experience of doing restoration implementation, trying to direct funding and convey the importance of doing beaver-centric restoration work, the slight change of having beaver mentioned in other habitat sections of the conservation strategy to being an actual listed strategy species is pretty fundamental to be able to point to that, because what that reflects is a more congruous culture around the view of the importance of beaver kind of more explicitly. And so when we're seeking funding, it makes for a much cleaner story, but it also clarifies the importance of beaver in ODF&W's mind. And if there ever was a kind of tacit vote for having beaver put as a strategy species, I mean, we have a beaver working group. We have so many people talking about it. It's obviously a critical, specific component that is really risen to the top. So I'm glad to hear people reiterating how big a strategy importance that is, because while it seems small to change that and pull that out of the text to a heading, the implications on the ground can be really large. So that, and then I didn't know, Jamie, when it kind of fits in kind of, I know the affinity groups kind of got an update on what the small working group was doing on things, but I did want to bring up a couple of bullet points that I feel that are kind of the real topics. Some of them have been touched on, but where I really feel like we're having good productive discussions in the subcommittee. And if I could just take a couple of minutes, is that all right?
So there's two. Yes, I think that's fine. I did want to, when I was done having people make their observations and reflections, I was going to shift to kind of the outstanding issues on the Jamboard and the subgroup piece of that. So Jefferson, I don't know if it makes more sense to do that then.
I can wait. Yep.
Okay, yeah, let's do that. Let's finish up these observations and reflections and then move more discreetly to, okay, what does this mean to the issues on the Jamboard? Because the subgroup needs your input in order to keep working on those topics. So we'll turn to all of you then. So Ernie.
Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead.
I would like to draw attention to what I believe are inconsistencies, but also opportunities in several of the presentations. And in particular, I want to go back to where Chris talked about the Science Affinity Group, talked about a framework for making decisions that explicitly recognizes risk. And we're in the context of very high risk coming from climate change and from the biodiversity crisis. And so we're looking for making decisions that indicate that they promise a positive reduction in that risk. And Jimmy pointed out that it's not simply just, beavers are good and everything else is bad. There are good things about beavers, there are bad things about beavers, and so it's on a net basis. But then I was particularly struck by Chair Wall, and if I misquote, why I do apologize, but the notes I took is, we're trying to manage species in a landscape context. The benefits they provide for climate change, water flow, water temperature, as we move towards more benefits. All right, so I heard in those two statements, or the statements from those two people, again, surfacing something that is music to my ears, is to focus on what sort of benefits can we get from beaver for Oregonians, and how do we maximize those net benefits. I want to contrast that though, and again, there's no judgment involved in this. It's just what I heard is that I heard Kevin say the data indicate that beavers are an abundant species across the landscape. Well, they can be abundant, but they still can have the promise of providing even more benefits than they already provide. So abundance is not really a very good criterion for making decisions. I also heard Kevin say, as fur bearers, there already is protection across the board. Well, again, that's looking at the critter, not looking at the benefits and our opportunities to get more benefits than we are already getting. And so what I strongly hope, and what I have been pushing for from the very first day, is let's always have this looking towards the horizon, both the short-term horizon and long-term horizon, and that surfaced in the context of the Jamboard, but looking toward the horizon of providing additional benefits to all Oregonians. So thank you.
Thanks for that, Ernie. Any other questions or reflections based on what people heard before we shift and look at the work of the subgroup and have some further discussions to flesh out some of the topics? Not seeing any. All right, I'm going to turn it over to, so Leland's not here, but we do have Amy, Chris, and Jefferson. And Jefferson, it sounds like you've teed up some things that you want to share with the larger group about where the subgroup is at, some sort of areas of agreement that you want to highlight to the full group. And then for Chris and Amy, and you too, Jefferson, be thinking about, when we get together next week, what are questions that you have of the larger group that can help us sort of move some things forward? So I'm going to turn it over to you, Jefferson, because you put your hand up first.
Yeah. I did want to start off, and this has kind of been a recurring thing, which I appreciate, is the frankness and openness of the discussions that we are having in the subcommittee group. And again, it's a real great example of where we're actually able to talk through the really contentious issues from completely different points of view and find that middle ground. And so all affinity groups, your representatives are representing you well and fighting for your ideas and holding ground and all, but also kind of in a reasonable way where we're all kind of conceding some things and understanding things. And I really feel like we're all learning from each other, which is really critically important, because that is what's inherent to the success of this process. And I think we're all seeing more and more the value of the process itself, and that in the future and going forward, and for the continuing monitoring or management of species, that having respectful conversations where we bring information and discuss things is the way to go about it, not having to rely on knee-jerk reactions or just staying in our corner. So just start off with that. But some of the things, and Amy, Chris, correct me if I'm wrong, but some of the things that we're really dialing down on and getting deep on are there's four things. One of them has already been touched on, and Ernie, you just kind of mentioned, is the idea of, are we managing a population, or are we managing their ability, the animal's ability to manage a landscape and a habitat? And just really want to continue to encourage people to think about how not only are the metrics of that different, but the actions one would take are different to achieve those completely apples and oranges different goals. They're correlated to each other, but they're different questions. So I just want to have that be back of people's minds. One thing that I think is really important to have people thinking about is that as this is a discussion, and a kind of an important example of how we can help collaboratively manage wildlife in the future, the idea put forth in the subcommittee group of having some sort of continued guidance in the future. And I don't know if this got mentioned in the meetings of all the affinity groups, but the idea of having some sort of group that continues on, like are in other aspects of ODF and W. There's the Tide Gates working group. There's the Fish Passage advisory group. There are different examples of this in ODF and W, but not to wait until there's a panic or a big problem to bring people together, but to work iteratively on that and to help move things going on. So that was one thing I wanted to make sure people had gotten updated on. The other big thing, the last big thing, is the notion of scale. And I think that's really going to be where there's going to be a lot of hard discussion, and that was also brought up today, because I think on one hand, there are people that see us living in an ecological house and our entire roof is rotting and we need to work on the entire roof. And there are people that may see that it's leaking through in a couple of places, and maybe we can just kind of patch up those different places. And so what we need to understand as a group is deciding if we are, again, trying to make differences on landscape scales and what sort of decisions need to be made on to affect landscape scale potential benefits, or if we are just trying to fix things on a very local, small scale basis, and how those overlap and how they may be similar, different, that sort of thing. But the scale of our actions is directly related to the scale of the benefits we want to achieve. So those were just the updates that I wanted to make sure were in back of people's minds.
All right, Chris, Amy, other things you want to bring forward to the full working group from the subgroup, or questions that you have for the full working group that could help our work? Amy, go ahead.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that we talked about in the last subgroup meeting too was, as we approach how we formulate some of this, the difference between being prescriptive and being process driven. I think it was agreed upon in the subgroup that, creating process level recommendations is probably going to be more beneficial in a sustained and long-term view of this than it is trying to be super prescriptive and, get down into the weeds of, we want to go here and do these specific things at this time for this, this particular event. And instead of thinking in that mindset, think more of, we want to recommend to implement process-driven recommendations that will have a more long-term effect on how the agency approaches how they deal with restoration or place-based closures, so that we get more out of the recommendations, that rather than just a kind of a one and done type of outlook on it. So that was a thing in my notes that I had that I hadn't really heard highlighted yet. So that was what I wanted to bring up.
Yeah, thanks for that, Amy. Jefferson, I see your hand up, but I did want to give Chris a chance to bring anything to the larger group's attention.
Yeah, thanks. I think Jefferson and Amy covered it well. My points reiterate what Amy just brought up about process rather than one-time set of recommendations, that we're really aiming for durable solutions, recommending durable solutions. And who are we recommending those solutions to, or to whom are we making those recommendations? I think one of our value or mission statements that Jamie, you led off the meeting with, says our target audience is ODF and W. I think, Kevin, when you were talking about what you saw our charge was, is to the commission. I think the commission also said, we want to hear from you. So I feel like we also have to think, maybe one part of this is by making these process and durable kind of recommendations. It is more giving material to the commission that can structure their passing on and their guidance to the agency, rather than saying, hey, ODF and W, you need to do this, because that just, we do worry about saying, we are not in, our job is not to tell you what your job is. We're trying to add this structure, and working through the commission is this process. And so I think of the commissioners as our primary audience, as Kevin said. I don't think we need to talk. No, let's not revisit any of the writing that we did in the first months, because that took a lot of time. But let's just keep in mind that we're thinking about those process approaches. And the issue of scale is one of the things that we're struggling with in that, both time and space. And then the thing that's come up a couple times today is sort of this net benefit framework, which is more of a risk management kind of a structure. How do we think about that rolls in, data collection to evaluate that you're doing the right thing. When you're doing something that you don't know the outcome of, then and you're curious, you want to manage that risk, then you need to understand, was your recommendation the right thing, and are you more inclined to make that recommendation in the future, or actually amplify that recommendation because it worked out? And that feedback cycle is something that we feel is necessary. And again, that's going to the durability and the long-term nature of the structure of the kind of recommendations. And I think not all of that maybe was reflected in the Jamboard, as we did that one sort of barfing out a whole bunch of ideas. So what I feel like we're doing is trying to put a structure on that. And I don't want, we're walking the fine line of inventing a structure from what looks like new material, as opposed to seeing that that's consistent with the guidance, consistent with the tasks and the ideas that were thrown up in the Jamboard, but trying to put some, what we hope, more useful framework there. And we do struggle with that in the small group. Are we getting ahead of the process and making stuff up? And I don't think we are. We're trying to make a context for it. So that context is the time and space scale, the sort of the durability, and the looking to reinforce processes as opposed to having a prescription that would be, as Amy said, once and done. It could be ignorable, dismissed, and then all of our work would be ignored, ignorable. Where I think there's been all of this coming together and working, and I think the commissioners pointed this out, is that itself has been beneficial, and that reflects the fact that there is a desire to not see this, hair on fire kind of reaction over and over again around an issue, actually to use this opportunity for a basis for a solution. If we don't reach a singular solution right now, how do we have a basis for keeping this issue moving forward, and that all of Oregon can imagine that we got it. We're there. We're building the process so that this can be managed going forward. So that's it. That's all. And it came up, the idea that we are going to constitute this group forever, or at least some subset of it. And that was panic inducing in all of us, because we wanted this to be done, but we can't have it be done and say we need a long-term ongoing process to make sure that we all together achieve this. So that's just a warning that all of your terms are going to be re-upped with no end date. But thanks.
Thanks, Chris. Hope people were smiling at that and nobody just bailed, so that's good. So let's hear from Jefferson and Amy, and then subgroup, let's pause with your input and hear from the full group some of their observations, questions, reflections on what they've heard from the subgroup.
Yeah,
So,
just real quick, I missed a couple of things on my notes. One is the idea that we're really working through and trying to figure out how it works is the timing of recommendations and making that clear. So it's not, some people worry that if you recommend monitoring or something, that's instead of action, or that we would take action without monitoring attached to it and that sort of thing. So Stan, your concern about having management actions without monitoring that's full on part of the discussion and is critical. And that's that holistic part that Jimmy, you've talked about many times, that we can't just do one thing in isolation. Things have to work together. So that was really important. The geographic thing, I think we've touched on, rather than just saying work here, it's more like work in these types of areas, kind of things for these reasons. And that provides guidance as maybe those conditions change, rather than being stuck with an exact geography. The other thing is in line of Chris's, we're not trying to invent things. We're just trying to kind of go within the guidance of what the big group has given us, categorizing some ideas as these seem to be situations that got us to where we are today in the confusion and the debate and the disagreement about how to manage Beaver. And so really trying to address, for example, data gaps and such, that led us to where we are today. So we're not in that same situation in the future. So kind of these overarching umbrella ideas before we even get to the exact recommendations, that we recognize as part of the issues leading to the problem. So when you read the recommendations, any of the written stuff, those are kind of like step 0.1 before you even get to recommendation 1. So just wanted to bring those up.
okay, Amy.
Yeah, and just kind of going off of what JJ just said there about the overarching recommendations too. One of the things that on the Jamboard that came up a lot too was, collaboration and MOUs between state and federal partners. And so I can't find the document, the working document. You would think in all of this that I could find it. But somewhere in there, and I didn't see it in what was sent out, is the very first bullet points that we talk about before we get into specific recommendation framework is the collaboration piece. And that there has to be that agreement between state and federal agencies. We've talked a little bit with ODFW staff about what's already in place. And, so this is not anything new with them. Obviously, they work with the federal partners already, but that kind of acknowledgement of the need for collaboration, because it kept popping up when we got into the more specific topics. And we just decided, well, let's just pull that to the very top of the document because it's a through line through everything that has to be done below it. So that's another thing to call out there. And then because Leland isn't here, but he said something that it kind of goes hand in hand with the process versus prescriptive comment. But he said this in the last work group meeting, and I actually wrote it down in my notes. So I'm going to quote Leland, focus on the objective rather than the tool. And I think that goes along really well with what we were talking about as far as, staying away from the more prescriptive pieces and trying to really stick with that overarching process piece. So wanted to give him credit for that since he's not here.
Thanks, Amy. And so now we want to take a step back, and you've heard from the subgroup, there's like 7 points that they've talked about. Are we managing the population, or are we managing a landscape that benefits from the population? If those are some there's different approaches there, and maybe it's an and. Number 2 is the ongoing a heads up about, they're saying that the recommendations will include an ongoing collaborative work group of some sort to keep this partnership moving forward. And number 3 is, just being mindful of the scale that we're working at, and it determines the range of actions that we might take. Number 4 is the group is moving away from prescriptive approaches and moving more towards process approaches that are durable, that provide durable solutions and structures and framework. Number 5 is focusing on the net benefit framework, that feedback cycle, just making sure that that's a part of whatever is built. Number 6 is, it sounds like they're interested in hearing any thoughts everybody has around that scale question, that, because they are struggling a little bit around, time and space. Anyway, and this idea of, I wrote down the word geographic guidance, which is, working in these types of areas on these types of things, as opposed to a very prescriptive approach, so that it gives you some more flexibility. And then number 7, I wrote down here is collaboration is part of all of it. And that's why they moved it up to the top of what they're thinking about. And so thinking about what could be strengthened, what needs to be put in place, and what those vehicles are to allow that structure of continued collaboration. So those are some, how did I do, subgroup? Just a head nod. I can't see you all. There you are. Thumbs up. Okay. So that's just a summary of kind of where they are and where they're headed. So what questions do you have, or comments, input do you have for the subgroup as they work on these? Are there things that are missing? Are there things you're concerned about? Do you just not understand some part of kind of what they're talking about? Brian, go ahead.
Yeah, okay. Just maybe I'm not tracking, but I heard what I heard talked about was sort of focus on process, collaboration, et cetera, not prescriptive. But I think to the extent the subgroup is representing all the participants in the work group, there needs to be some talk about prescriptive outcomes and where there might be a consensus or something close to a consensus. And some of those things have been talked about, for example, clarifying the regulations for beavers on federally managed public land that's leased. I think we heard kind of agreement about considering beavers as a strategy species in the conservation plan. And I think we, to talk about the elephant in the room, I think we have to talk about closures. And the way I think about that issue is, it's just, do we change the default setting from open to closed, leaving room for, somebody can show that that they would sort of be in a position of having to demonstrate scientifically in this area, we could reopen it and it wouldn't hurt the beaver population or the benefits they provide, versus sort of putting the burden of proof on the advocates of closures. But I think that issue's got to be addressed if the subgroup is going to be representing the whole group, and whether there's any kind of anything that folks can come close to agreement on. I don't think we're ever going to get everybody to agree to some of this stuff, but is there something that we can get close on? I just think that has to be addressed, and there has to be something said about that. What could be agreed to and what couldn't. Thanks.
Thanks for that, Brian. Ernie and then Jefferson.
Thank you, Jamie. I have a short question, but I think it's an important one, and it's addressed to the subcommittee, but it's also addressed to you, Jamie. What do you all see as the product of all of this? What's it going to look like? Is it words in a file, words on a paper, or is it something more than that? Where are we headed?
Yeah, so I mean, it will be a report. That's what we've been asked to provide. It will be a report to the commission for them to consider and for them to deliberate on, and provide some direction to the ODFW staff about the parts that they would like to implement and move forward. So that's what that's the form it would come in. And when you say more than words on a page, I'm thinking video, song, I'm not sure what other form it would come in, but so I don't know if you have something in mind.
Well, the mind boggles when you start talking about dancing, whatever. But no. So again, just to clarify, so the subcommittee is going to draft the recommendations. Are you going to draft the recommendations for the subcommittee, and the subcommittee then conveys those to the full group?
Yeah, that's a good clarification.
Or do you draft something that goes to the full group, and then the subcommittee listens to the full group and distills that down? Help me understand the process here.
Yeah, that's a good clarification, Ernie. Thank you for that. If there is an opportunity for a song or a dance or a video, we'll certainly explore that. But just in terms of process steps, so the subgroup has been taking all the conversations from the full group and trying to organize it amongst themselves about what's the flow that makes sense. Amy says if this turns into a musical, she's out. All right, well, I'll take that under advisement. And so the subgroup has been taking all the input from all the conversations, not input. I mean, it's basically taking your conversations and trying to organize it in a way that makes sense. And then so the affinity group check-ins that we did and this conversation is really like, are we headed in the right direction? And so I just really appreciate Brian being really clear about, it's like, there are some prescriptive things that we'd like, that Brian and his constituency would like to see in this report. So that kind of thing, it helps to temper the subgroup. So the subgroup is having these discussions. Sam and I are going to be writing the report. And then, we're the ones that are going to be putting this on page. We'll bring it back to the subgroup. So we'll be like, yeah, you're hitting the mark, or no, this isn't what we talked about. And then we'll be bringing that back to all of you. The idea is we're going to have a draft report for you to look at in the middle of February, first iteration of that in advance of our end of February full work group meeting. And then that gives us a good 6 weeks to really work on those words on the page or the song or whatever else we want to do, and just really make sure, is this saying what we want it to say? So I know it feels a little amorphous right now because we don't have that to hand to you, but that's the next thing that you'll see. Does that help, Ernie?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, Jefferson.
Yep. I did want to say that process, we have fully realized, I think in the subcommittee, the explicit need of having Jamie and Sam kind of doing that writing and congealing of stuff, because just the day-to-day logistics of getting something that makes sense in English on the page in a committee requires somebody to be that lightning rod and put it down. So, and I will say, Jamie and Sam have been doing a good job of representing what we're saying as a group on the page so far. So there's trust there, and there's examples for moving forward. Brian, to your question about closures and stuff, I think it's important to realize that in regard to closures and being the elephant in the room, it would be an elephant in the room if that's all we were talking about. And one of the things I'm proud about in this working group is that's not all we're talking about. We're talking about so much more. It's a lot of ands rather than this or that. And that when we talk about closures, we're not talking about bans specifically. So I don't know if everyone's picked up on the different semantics that we're using. We're using closures, and so that's a management tool rather than outright bans, and that closures are not necessarily a black and white thing in some respects. There's things to talk about there. How long do they last? What conditions would they be under? But most importantly is that idea that closures proposed, how closures would be used is not in isolation of other things. So again, that data collection aspect, looking at how they integrate with other aspects of management recommendations, because they won't work well enough without that sort of linkage into other things. So I feel kind of like the conversations matured beyond just that panic stage of kind of a binary reference to those sorts of things. So just wanted to bring that up.
Thanks for that, Jefferson. Josh, and then Chris.
Yeah, thanks. Just want to first off thank this small group willing to work and dig in and meet regularly to start drafting these recommendations. The one thing I did want to just throw out there, being that the key question is around federally managed land and there's no federal land managers engaged in those conversations, in case you do have any questions, or not that I in any way, shape, or form have the capacity to join weekly multi-hour meetings in addition to these, but be happy to pop in for one or two or email response to questions that are raised on federal land management authorities there, just because it is just slightly concerning that, folks aren't necessarily who manage federal lands that are aware of the regulations that kind of govern the sideboards for our management and our monitoring programs, et cetera, are not at the table in this small group drafting recommendations that we can provide any insight into what we are currently doing and or what our authorities are, be happy to provide.
And thanks for that, Josh. And for the full group, when we met with Josh and Darren yesterday, they both said that they would be happy to be that resource. What we don't want to have happen, and what we told Josh and Darren this, is, we don't want to have a report come back to this full group and have our federal partners be like, no, not going to do that. And so, so that's why we need to, there are some options and ideas that they have that could be a part of the recommendations moving forward that help to complement, their partnership with the state. And so we appreciated them pointing that out, which is one of the reasons we did the affinity group conversations, was to make sure we weren't there. There were stones that were, we were turning over every stone. Chris, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I want to follow up on the process versus specific recommendations characterization. I was a little horrified as I thought back and of what I said, and if it's all about process, I can see people saying, wait a minute, what are you doing? You're just suggesting another bit of bureaucracy. We don't need that. We are talking about a mixture of, and we haven't quite used this language, sort of short-term and long-term actions, and those came out of the Jamboard exercise. We identified in that the sort of low-hanging fruit or immediately actionable things, put them maybe in the categories of not controversial. That is, we could get likely outcomes quickly and easily because they aren't they're not going to take a lot of further design and discussion, and not stopping there, and thinking that not everything could fit in that category and everything should fit in that category of prescription. And that's where we migrated to talking about building process to be more durable and to support long-term discussion about some of the topics that are going to take more work to get action. And so I hope folks will think that we'll realize that we're going to have a mixture of recommendations that'll come out of this draft, that we are talking about a range of those scales. And I think we need to figure out some language that everyone likes around that short-term, long-term, easy to do, process versus prescription. I don't think it matters, but the idea is here are some things that recommendations that came out of this group that are potentially short-term, easily actionable, and then others that are best supported if the suggestion is developing a process by which those suggestions can be achieved. So a balance.
Brian, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, and just to clarify my comments, I mean, I didn't mean to suggest that closures were this black and white issue that should be considered in isolation. I get that it's nuanced and that it needs to be, I mean, I agree with what several people have said, that it would be crazy to do closures and then not monitor to figure out if you can connect that to an outcome. So I get that. I get it's complicated. I get it happens with other things. I get that it's nuanced. I didn't mean to suggest otherwise. I was trying to just be, efficient in my comments and say, I think it needs to be talked about.
Yeah, and I mean, this is what this forum is for, Brian. It's to clarify, it's to say, how are the conversations of this full group being characterized in a potential, in a document, and what kinds of things are you looking for when you see a draft report in February? It's just like, what are you going to be looking for? And so I think it is, Brian, really important that you point out. It's like, hey, and Chris clarifying too. It's like, it's not going to be all about process. There are some things that this group has talked about very specifically. There's some folks that are going to be looking for, it's like, how are we treating closures? What are we saying about that? That needs to be in the document. So I think those are the kinds of things that we're looking for from everybody to make sure that we're hitting the mark in the way that you expect. Ernie, go ahead.
Thank you. To repeat something that I already said, and I apologize for that, but I want to make certain that I'm heard. The discussion of bans or closures or whatever the action is, I believe we've heard from Chair Wall and from others that rather than focus on the critter, let's focus on the benefits, the net benefits. So if the benefits of killing the beaver exceed the costs, kill the damn beaver. That's what economics tells us. If we have a goal of providing benefits to Oregonians. But if the benefits are less than the cost, then let's not do so. Now, if the only way for getting to that endpoint is something called a ban or something called a closure or some rule and some regulation, then okay, then let's live with that, but let's be smart about it. But if there is a process so that we can focus on maximizing net benefits, then let's have that process. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Ernie. Amy, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to just bring up, I finally found the document that I was looking for with all of our notes. I think there's several areas that we're trying to address here as well. And it's an interesting conversation for me because as this group got started, this is where I feel like we were talking past each other on a lot of things. There's the population discussion, and then there's the more of the landscape analysis discussion. And that's kind of when you look at the top three things that came out of the Jamboard, the landscape analysis to prioritize areas was the top one, and population and data collection was the second. And so it's interesting to have those conversations around those two topics because they do trend a little bit differently. I think some of us anybody on here who is kind of used to the, I'm going to just say the usual way that we look at species management. Population is a huge factor in that. And so getting the data on population numbers and making sure that we're kind of prioritizing some of that focus, that falls into that second bullet point. But then how do beavers work on the landscape? How do we maximize that? That falls into that first question. And so the subgroup, I think, is grappling with and doing a fair job, I think, of trying to answer both of these things that seem to be, they interplay, but they're actually kind of different thought processes when you talk about population and population dynamics and population numbers and kind of more of that straight species management topic versus the landscape habitat pieces and what can they do on the landscape and how do we maximize those. And so where I think we used to talk past each other as a work group, I think in the subgroup, we're trying to take those things and bring them more into alignment, and how do we incorporate each of them in the other conversation while still giving credence to both of those somewhat different, ideologies or thought processes. So I know that we've talked on here today a little bit. We've gone back to population numbers and there's been comments about, we shouldn't focus on the critters. We should focus on what they do. But I think to be successful, and Chris, I really loved the word you used, the durable word. I think that's a great moniker for what we're trying to do here. To really find those durable solutions, I think we have to look at both of those pieces and then address the needs on both sides of those topics. So just another thought on that.
Thanks for that, Amy. Stan, go ahead.
Can you hear me? Nope.
Yep,
yes, we can hear you.
We can hear you.
Okay. I'm sorry. This isn't, virtual is not the way some of us would ever think that a process this in depth should be conducted, because you can see the technological problems, but that's the world we're in. I just want to point something that Ernie brought up, and there's another process that's ongoing through Oregon Solutions on ungulate depredation management. So we have to keep in mind that how many are enough, and that we will or potentially have a saturation point of all species, especially those species that can be damage causing. So I just think keep that in mind, that this isn't the unicorn species that's going to save the world from climate change. But it is a species that's important to all of us, and having that abundance, but at a managed level. So keep in mind that wildlife conservation is wildlife management, and management tools have to be available to our managers to do a good job of conservation management. So I'm just throwing that in there, and I'm not disagreeing with a lot of what I've heard today. There's some good recommendations coming forth, but let's get back and keep in mind, this thing's all revolving around discussions on how we're going to improve salmonid habitats and the benefits to those. ESA delisting, whatever it may be, of some different species. And this is just one component of that larger delisting process that we're in. And when we're in a process such as that, doesn't mean there can't be regulated management and regulated harvest of those species. And so, looking at the Oregon Hatchery Research Center and so many of the great projects that are going on there, there's a constant analysis that's going on of those processes and of those different experiments that we're trying to see how we can lessen impacts and risk. So Ernie, I don't disagree that it's about risk management, but I'm going to say this from a large constituency. We can't worry about the sky falling to the point that we live in such fear that we fail to live our daily lives. And all of us are aware of global climate change and the impacts that's having, but we're still fishing, we're still driving, we're still doing these things. So let's just, I keep hearing this fear. And for Chair Wall and others who really seem to put that out there all the time, we're going to balance the best that we can and live within reasonable parameters.
Thanks for that, Stan. Ernie, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Stan, I think this is the fourth or fifth time that you've mischaracterized what I've said. I have not used the word fear at all. So I wish you would just get off of that track. What I did say is that we face risk. We have to make risk-based decisions. I very explicitly said if the benefits of killing the beaver exceed the cost, kill the beaver. But let's make that decision rather than just having some process that says, let's continue to do what we have been doing. So please do not misrepresent me at all. Thank you.
Well, I have to respond.
Go ahead, Stan, and then let's take a step back, but go ahead. We can hear you.
Okay, so there's no mischaracterization at all from my characterization of what I'm hearing. And Ernie, what I'm saying is, through the process, we're saying, this whole process was saying that trappers are killing so many beaver that we're having a negative impact on the environment. We've yet to see one shred of data that supports that assertion. So there's where Oregon trappers are sitting and staying. We've had circular discussions, but yet we've yet to see a shred of data that says Oregon's current regulated beaver management process is having a negative ecological impact on salmonid recovery, habitat recovery, or whatever it may be. Show us the evidence that the beaver that are being removed on federal lands from recreational or regulated harvest is having a negative impact on our environment.
Okay, I understand that. That's a good thing to say, and I'll yield to the scientists on the science. But in terms of risk, what you just said is looking over your shoulder. And what I'm saying is that looking ahead of us is a very different risk-dominated reality. And so we ought to be taking that much larger risk into account. And so the issue is not whether past trapping has had these effects. The issue is what is the likelihood that future trapping will have negative effects. And if there is a likelihood that future trapping will have negative effects, then we ought to be making a decision. The commission ought to be making a decision. The department ought to be making a decision to avoid those negative outcomes.
Every day that we manage a fishery, there's a risk assigned to. And when we have mixed stock fisheries, Ernie, there's always a risk factor that a hatchery fish, while we're trying to harvest in the ocean, Columbia River coho, that we will have a drop-off rate on ESA listed wild coho returning to Oregon's coastal streams. It's a risk factor that's built into the decision-making process. ODFW does a fantastic job of analyzing those risks, providing that data to the commission, and the commission then makes hopefully a wise policy decision. No different in Oregon beaver management or in elk, deer, wolf, cougar, or whatever management that we have. And so I'm relatively confident in ODFW's ability to assess risk and then regulate or propose regulations that have those risk assessments put forth before the commission. That's where I'm coming from on this.
And I talk to an awful lot of people who look across all of those species that you just talked about and conclude that the department and the commission are not doing a good job with the risks that are in front of us. That instead they are locked into assessments of the past when we had much more abundance, much less risk of things just going to pieces across the board. And so there have to be systemic changes within the department, rather than saying, well, what we do with fish means that we can do the same thing with beavers. I reject that reasoning and the assumptions underlying them. And I think that that's something that the subcommittee must explicitly address.
So I'm going to pause you guys. And one of the reasons why I think it's important to let this conversation go a little bit is, it's a conversation you guys wanted to have. First of all, I think it's important for us to hear where you're headed. And I think it's a great example of, it's not an either or. I think this is one of those examples of and. I mean, this, what you guys have both just talked about. So, Stan is saying, Stan's talking about the current program, the current regulation, the data that we have or don't have, and what we know today. And Ernie's talking about the and, which is the future, and so I think, the whole purpose of this work group is to address both of those. It's like, what do we know and don't know about the existing program in terms of how it's managing beaver for, currently and for the future and for possible benefits. So I think that, I don't know that, you guys could pick up the phone and talk to each other for probably a good couple hours on this and come back and report back to us. But I do think it's an example of an and that's where you heard the subgroup is, that's where they are at as well, which is, you can hold two truths. There are two things that you can hold at the same time and they can both be true. And so that's really where we're at. So I appreciate, Stan and Ernie, your willingness to, have this little dialogue with all of us watching and everybody at home watching. And I appreciate that. I think that it helps us sort of unpack, sort of kind of where you are. But I do think that there's space for both of you. Chris?
Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to reiterate what you just said, Jamie, is I think Ernie and probably a lot of us have been talking past each other, and the more we have the chance to have these conversations, the clearer what we're trying to say becomes. And I think that interchange that Ernie and Stan that you just had, I'm hoping for others, it certainly did for me, clarified the context of the risk assessment by asking, is the current regulatory framework adequate going forward? And that's the risk assessment. Not, is there a risk assessment of the current management framework in the current times, but under our sort of non-stationary, our changing environment. And fisheries management is a great example of not knowing how to do the climate-driven changes to fisheries management. And so yes, Stan, those things are going well now, and they have learned from past mistakes. But that entire enterprise, which I'm part of, is struggling with how to add recommendations that come from science, like ecosystem-based management and climate change. And so the science answers aren't clear. So there's not this deterministic, just do this, because it's a question of knowing the future. And we can't know the future. But what we do know is that it's going to be different from the past. And we do know some of the things that we have depended on as a basis for productivity for ocean fisheries, for example, are going to change. And we think they're going to change for the worse because of some outlier years that have passed. And the only way we are able to think about that is there will become more of those bad outlier years. That is, the bad will become more the average. And how do we then structure management in that new reality? And that's where we have to take this risk, or it's suggested, and it's probably a good idea, that we take a risk-adverse approach to structuring management, knowing that our current management structure will become worse and worse going forward, because our current management structure is based on looking at the recent past. or the recent past tells us how biology interacts, the sort of animal part of the biology interacts with the environment, and the environment is the habitat and the climate on a short term. And that's how we manage all of these fish and wildlife species. And that structure, what we're struggling with in a climate changing world is that structure has to also include the fact that some of our tools for looking into the recent past, for projecting next year's harvest or 3 years out, is going to get worse and worse. And so how do we do that? And there are lots of suggestions. There is no silver bullet. There is no current framework for doing that, other than what Ernie is saying is, hey, we should take a slightly risk adverse approach, because what if we get it wrong? And we get it wrong, and we're more and more likely to get it wrong. So how do we build in some buffer for wrongness, for being wrong, from a management structure that exists? We're not saying that the management structure or having a management structure is bad. We're saying the rule set that we use and the process that we use is going to become fragile, and I'm going to be more and more likely to not be able to use past examples of biological processes like replacement rates or ocean productivity for fisheries as projections of what's available for exploitation in the near future. And that's where this risk-averse idea comes in. It doesn't discount everything we've done in the past. It's just saying we know that that isn't going to work for us in the future. And how do we build in that buffer? And that's the risk aversion part. Buffer is a deterministic version of something that's probabilistic, which is the risk framework. And so I appreciate that interchange that you guys both had, because that puts it in a context that it makes more sense to me. And I think that the subgroup hasn't thought about that future component as much, and how to deal with projecting forward in the future and setting up, as Amy said, this durable way of doing things. It's durable to the fact that we don't know how environmental conditions are going to change across the state. And how do we suggest management frameworks that achieve the benefits that we all said we want, but are more likely to achieve those benefits as the landscape changes underneath us? So I appreciate that and ability to have that conversation to at least for me, turn that light bulb on. And I'm hoping that we have that conversation more within the subgroup.
Brian?
Yeah, thanks. So I went back and forth on whether to get in line for this and decided to do it. But I just did want to make a couple of quick comments on the Stan and Ernie dialogue. And one is Stan says we shouldn't be fearful. Maybe not, but I do think there is some urgency around the situation of stream flows and warming water temperatures and climate change. And the reason these fish are listed as threatened is because they're in trouble. I do think there is some urgency to this topic, and if there's something that can be done with beaver management that will improve stream flows and stream temperatures and stream, floodplain characteristics and so forth, that we ought to be getting on it, because from everything I hear and read, it is an urgent situation. Second of all, Stan says there is not a shred of proof that hunting and trapping is having any negative environmental effect. And what we're talking about here is just reducing the number of beaver dams and having a detrimental effect on floodplains, I think. And I'm not a scientist in this area, but I do hear people who are say that they think there is solid evidence that it is having a detrimental effect. But I think more importantly, a point that we've been trying to make in this process is there scientific evidence that it's not? Do we know that it's not impacting the number of beaver dams and therefore all the benefits that those provide? And if we don't know that, shouldn't we err on the side of caution here?
Amy, go ahead.
Just real quick to Brian, to what you were just saying there, if we don't know that, I think the answer is, if we don't know that, we really ought to invest in finding out too. In addition, we really need to dig into getting the data that can help inform us. One thing that and I'm going to say this, and I'm going to ask Kevin or Derek or Tom to jump in and correct me if I'm wrong here, but it seems like we talk about species management and the way that the department is approaching it as a very static approach and unchangeable. And I think if anybody's watched the commission meetings and seen, the rules that get temporary rules that get put in place almost at every meeting to speak to a lot of what we're talking about here, right? And especially in the fisheries world, there are temporary rules. There are tag adjustments that we do in big game management. There's any number of levers that the department can pull within their management purview to address a lot of this. And so I feel like there's just a little bit of a misnomer perhaps in how we're talking about the current management structure as something that's unchangeable or non-responsive to the needs of the species. And I don't believe that to be the case. I think within the current structure and the current way that ODFW manages species, they allow room for this. I think sometimes I feel like I need to remind all of us that, these guys are wildlife biologists and this is their what they do. And I don't think any wildlife biologist would approach management as a static, we set a plan and we don't ever deviate from it, process. So I think we do need to recognize that there is the ability to be nimble. There is the ability to adapt management already built into what ODFW does within species management. And again, I'll throw it to the ODFW staff if I'm speaking on turn here.
There's an invitation to Tom, Kevin, Derek. Any of you want to weigh in on Amy's comment?
Yeah, this is Kevin, Jamie, and the group. What Amy said is exactly right. When we look across, I'll have to kind of stay at an elevation level here, but certainly across fish and wildlife, fish is extremely proactive. When you look at management along the Columbia River, particularly, it's lots and lots of temporary rules. If we look at what we did last year in regards to changes of seasons and bag limits and hunter participation due to fires and some drought conditions on pronghorn hunters, we literally were asking hunters to stay home and giving them opportunities, incentives really to not go out because of certain issues. And so there is absolutely that, reaction and adaptability that we put on the ground. We see that across other species. I know as Derek, who's, the keeper of the fur taker regulations, those also go through that same evaluation. You look at changes across the landscape that have happened in populations. Bobcats are a really good example. It's not been static across a number of different years in our regulation cycle. So I don't know if I can add any more clarity to that, but everything Amy said is true. There's a lot of adaptability. These are not just we don't want to change the regulations, let's make it easy and everything goes forward with the same recommendation. As we present those recommendations to the policymakers, to the commission, they have a background for those regulations. A lot of times I'm thinking on the migratory bird side, we show, population evaluations across the flyway for certain species that lead to changes, or, those changes could be increases of seasons of bag limits or decreases. So a very adaptable process that we have across fish and wildlife.
Thank you, Kevin. Jefferson, go ahead, and then it's a 12:15. We're scheduled to end at 12:30. I want to reserve about 5 minutes just to remind us what's happening next in the upcoming meetings. And so that gives us about 10 minutes for any final comments, any further direction for the subgroup, or any questions that you have for the full group. So Jefferson, go ahead.
Yeah, and I don't know if this is worth saying, but I think the examples of flexibility there and adaptability of management is in my mind what I'm hoping we're going to bring to beaver management, because in my impression of this and looking at kind of the regulations and stuff, besides individual areas asking specifically for closures, that in the area specifically of beaver management, there hasn't been that flexibility or history of input like the other species beyond those specific areas of closures. And that was the problem with legislative management of beaver for so many years. So I see that as an opportunity to have all those examples that were given that were other species besides beaver to bring that level of care and data-driven adaptability to beaver management.
All right, so we've got, we certainly could end a little bit early, but I mean, we have 10 minutes as a full group. And so it does, before I need to just do a little bit of a wrap up. So any other sort of, final reflections or thoughts that you want to send off to the subgroup? Our next full meeting will be the end of February. And kind of while you're thinking about it, when we did do all the affinity group meetings in the last 2 weeks, we heard from nearly every group that said, hey, this was really valuable. We'd be glad to do it again. And so, to make our end of February work group meeting really productive, it may be that once we get a draft that we can float, that we do another round of affinity group conversations. I'm just thinking off the top of my head right now. So just, you might want to, so you could expect that. We'll talk about that a little bit more at the subgroup. So any other final things, Chris?
Yeah, so to help us in the subgroup think about how we can bring the climate change and sort of this risk-based net benefit management structure ideas forward that are in a way that are consistent with which is already underway with state fish and wildlife management. So Kevin, you talked about a bunch of examples of a sort of adaptive management of fish and wildlife that the agency does. I think all those examples were pretty real time, sort of in season, responding to the Columbia River is return based, so adults are back. Then you see that you're under the return rate, and you would do changes because you can't project the ability to take. We talked about the fire-based responses. That's clearly responding to an in-season situation. What I was bringing up, and I think Amy, you were reacting to, is this long-term underlying climate change based, and I don't know of any, certainly in the fisheries, management rulemaking and forecasting that has a climate change component built in. And so if we are going to make these kind of recommendations, it'd be great to have examples to say how our forecasts of environmental conditions, what examples are there? And I see Tom, you raise your hand, that's great. So I'd like to hear some if there are, so that we can say this is reasonable, or there is a precedent for thinking about long-term environmental change, increases in environmental uncertainty, and how do you build that forecasting in? I know the marine fisheries world is struggling with it. It's not that people don't want to do it, but it means changing the underlying process for doing the management. So Amy, it's not saying not being adaptive, but it's adapting to something different and that we have no experience in. Real-time in-season management, we have lots of experience in, and everyone's really good at it. But this is a new animal.
It is.
Go ahead, Tom.
Yeah, I just like to point out kind of the way we're thinking about this on the fisheries side is through sliding scale management, where we kind of understand what that baseline has been, and you put in place controls. If that baseline is changing, you're changing your regulations. So Stan actually mentioned the Rogue South Coast Plan, which the commission just adopted in December. I significant component of climate change analysis and what that's going to look like, we put in place some controls around fisheries harvest, where, if we're seeing a change in that baseline, things are happening more frequently where populations are forecasted to dip below, the angling regulations are going to change as those happen. So that's kind of the way we're thinking about it. So essentially, the harvest gets tightened up as climate change is happening, or maybe it isn't, based on all the other things that are called for in that plan to kind of buffer that. So that's one way we're thinking about it. And we do pre-season forecasts in a number of different places that can take those things into account.
Can you say, you called it did you call it sliding scale management? What was the term you used?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay.
Sliding scale.
Kevin, it sounds like you wanted to add something.
Yeah, and kind of more specifically just over on the wildlife side. So to say they're in a lot of proactive stuff, there is definitely a lot of proactive stuff. One thing is we were, Tom and Matt particularly, working on presenting some of the beaver analysis stuff in regards to the aquatic inventory data. One thing we struggled with, should we try to dig into the concept of sustainable harvest? And as we talk across these suite of species, sustainable harvest really depends, you have to focus on the critter you're looking at. So let me give an example of California quail population, mountain quail population, those sorts of critters where if you're undertaking harvests on those, a huge proportion of your harvest is young of the year, because those animals' average lifespan once they hatch out of the egg is less than a year. And so it really depends on what you're harvesting in regards to your outlook for what that means, how you're predicting that. So that's where for, the many of the species that we're looking to harvest, that's the framework you're looking in. What is that sustainable harvest? What are some metrics that we can measure that would look toward what the opportunity, the recruitment that year for the young are going to be? A lot different on the wildlife side for many of our species than it is on, particularly for anadromous fish in their cycle with the ocean, rearing as well as coming back into the basin. So I would say that we have some really unique tools for doing that. A lot of that relying on inventorying animals, inventorying, recruitment, which would be a, young per hen, or, fawns per, doe. Those sorts of issues really help you drive then your population modeling, which absolutely looks to the future. Population models also include age structure, and it includes some parameters that you can tweak in regards to the types of winter that you just had, or if you're expecting drought impacts that are generally predicted by some modeling, you can include that in there as well. So there are definitely dynamic opportunities for us to do that. I would say, though, that as everybody has emphasized, the metrics for staying within your bounds of meeting your objective for sustainable harvest has become more difficult in the light of climate change and what that means on some particularly desert habitats. But that's also things that we take into consideration. So just wanted to emphasize that has a definite overlay on the wildlife as well as the fish side.
Thanks for that, Kevin. Really helpful information. Jefferson, your hand's up, and you're going to be our last person to speak before I do a summary of schedule and where we're going next.
It's a great example of what Amy was talking about populations versus impact on the ground there. So the idea of sustainable harvest really is driven by populations sustainability. And so when you're talking about species like California quail that aren't keystone species and changing the habitat around them, your management objective can be just, let's not have California quail get so few in numbers that we can't hunt them anymore. And so that's the difference in those descriptions. The other thing that you're talking about were some of the tools that are used to achieve sustainable harvest. And those involve specifically taking dispersing young, being able to look at taking individuals of a certain sex with deer or reproductive status and that sort of thing. And right now, beaver trapping isn't set up to incentivize that sort of selective take. And so it really can maximize the impact on not only the population, but on the local impacts that beaver can have on the landscape. So just an opportunity there to show an example of how we can seem like we're talking about the same thing, but those slight differences of that end objective and the tools that get us there are really important. So thanks.
Thanks, Jefferson. So here we are wrapping up. A couple things I wanted to highlight. So the first is that we had a beaver management work group scheduled for February 3rd, and we're not going to do that. Our next beaver management work group will be February 24th. And then the subgroup is meeting next week, and we'll meet probably 2 more times in February before our full work group meeting. We're looking at getting a report out to all of you, a first draft, probably the middle of February. So you can expect that. We may do another round of affinity groups around that report. If there's questions, we'll cross that bridge when we get there. And we're like I said in the beginning, we're really trying to line up towards an April commission meeting if we can. But if it looks like we need a little bit more time, commissioners have said they're flexible for us to go to June. Better to have a good product than to rush. But we're aiming for that April timeframe. There's a couple people on our call today, on our meeting today, that we didn't get to hear from at all. And so we might do some follow-up with you. So we didn't hear much from Wayne. And so I want to make sure that we get Wayne's benefit, that we benefit from Wayne's knowledge and how we're moving forward. So Wayne, we're probably going to give you a call to follow up. And then Drenda, I don't think we heard from you at all. And Lauren left. And so, again, be thinking about what you heard today, and we can follow up with you on that. Otherwise, I think we heard from everybody else. So I just wanted to acknowledge that. And so I don't have anything else. I think this has been just a really remarkable conversation today. I just appreciate everybody's willingness to have me sort of slow the discussion down a little bit into these different components. I appreciate so much, Stan and Ernie, your willingness to be in a little fishbowl for everybody to watch your discussion. I think we all learned a lot from that. And I just appreciate the respectful way that you worked through that and in your differences of opinions, and how everyone just really, stepped in today and was very clear and candid and frank about what you're looking for in the report, what you're asking for from each other, and your support of this work group moving forward. So I don't have anything more to share about that, but I think this has just been a really remarkable conversation today. So I appreciate that. So I think that ends our meeting on a bit of a high note. So have a fabulous weekend and